China built a $5 billion elevated railway that's transforming Kenya, and you're about to discover why this single infrastructure project represents something far more powerful than just transportation. This isn't about trains moving people from point A to point B. It's about geopolitical leverage disguised as development, economic control disguised as progress, and continental domination disguised as investment. The Mombasa to Nairobi Railway cut travel times from 12 hours down to 4.5 hours. You heard that right. Slashing a journey that used to take half a day into something you could complete during a single workday. In the next few minutes, you're going to understand how one railway in Africa became the blueprint for how China is systematically reshaping global power dynamics without anyone even realizing it's happening. And it all starts with a port city drowning in cargo that nobody could move. The impossible dream, Mombasa to Nairobi. You're standing at the intersection of ambition and desperation. Kenya's port city of Mombasa was strangling under the weight of cargo that had nowhere to go. Container ships arrived daily, unloading thousands of tons of goods meant for markets across East Africa. But there was a catastrophic problem that nobody could solve. No efficient way to move that cargo inland to where it was actually needed. The road between Mombasa and Nairobi was a nightmare of congestion, delays, and inefficiency that paralyzed regional trade. Trucks crawled through 575 miles of challenging terrain, navigating potholes, weather delays, mechanical breakdowns, and traffic congestion. The journey that should have taken 6 hours stretched into 12 grueling hours of driving through conditions that destroyed vehicles and exhausted drivers. The economic cost was absolutely staggering. Delays meant perishable goods spoiled before reaching markets. Manufacturing deadlines were missed because raw materials arrived weeks late. Regional trade was constrained, not by market demand, but by physical transportation limitations that nobody could overcome. Mombasa's port had unlimited capacity to receive cargo from global shipping routes, but its capacity to move goods inland was pathetically limited. The bottleneck was creating economic paralysis across the entire region. Port authorities watched ships arrive and depart, unable to significantly increase throughput because inland transportation couldn't handle additional volume. Every inefficient truck journey represented economic loss, lost opportunity, spoiled goods, delayed manufacturing, frustrated customers waiting for products that couldn't arrive quickly enough. Western infrastructure companies looked at the project and rejected it completely. Every major international firm that evaluated the proposal concluded it was impossible. The challenges seemed genuinely insurmountable. Building a railway across such difficult terrain required solving engineering problems that had never been solved before. Protecting wildlife habitats and national parks meant designing infrastructure that had never been attempted. Managing political complexity between multiple stakeholders seemed overwhelming. The price tag was astronomical. The financial risks were immense. The construction timeline seemed aggressively optimistic given the technical difficulties. Every established player in global infrastructure concluded that this project was simply too difficult, too expensive, and too risky to justify the investment. But China didn't see an impossible project. They saw an opportunity that everyone else was too afraid to pursue. In 2013, the China Road and Bridge Corporation stepped forward with a proposal that shocked the international development community. They would finance and build a modern elevated standard gauge railway connecting Mombasa to Nairobi. $5 billion, modern technology, world-class engineering standards. A timeline that seemed aggressively optimistic to skeptics. Kenya's government accepted, and construction began in 2014. What followed was one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects Africa had ever witnessed. The railway wasn't a simple line connecting two cities. It was a statement about what China could build, what China could finance, and what China could accomplish across an entire continent. Every mile of track represented a commitment. Every bridge was a demonstration of engineering capability. Every station was a symbol of modernization arriving in East Africa. The real tension that nobody acknowledged at first was that this wasn't just about moving cargo more efficiently. This was about creating dependency that would reshape regional politics for decades. But the engineering challenges that lay ahead would prove to be far more complex and far more ambitious than anyone had anticipated. The engineering miracle elevated above everything. You're now witnessing engineering on a scale that transforms how humans understand infrastructure development. The railway route stretches across 312 miles of some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. The path crosses through Kenya's coastal regions, climbs through dense forests, navigates around national parks teeming with endangered wildlife, and ascends into highlands, where elevation changes create technical nightmares for railway construction. The engineers faced a fundamental problem. How do you build a railway that moves millions of tons of cargo annually while simultaneously protecting one of Africa's most fragile ecosystems? Traditional railway construction was impossible. The solution was revolutionary. Build the railway elevated above the landscape itself, creating bridges and overpasses that allow the natural world to continue functioning beneath. The numbers are staggering. The project required over 400 bridges spanning distances from just a few feet to nearly 1,000 feet. Each bridge had to be engineered to withstand intense seismic activity, tropical storms with winds exceeding 80 miles per hour, and the weight of freight trains carrying massive loads. The engineering specifications were so demanding that traditional construction methods couldn't achieve the precision required. But here's what separates this from ordinary railway construction: wildlife overpasses. The engineers designed specialized bridges and underpasses that allow animals to migrate across their traditional routes without encountering trains. Elephants can cross beneath the railway. Predators can traverse their hunting grounds. The ecosystem continues functioning while modern commerce operates above it. This wasn't engineering for its own sake. This was engineering that acknowledged ecological reality. The elevated design also solved another critical problem: drainage. In regions prone to intense rainfall and flooding, traditional ground-level railways would become impassable during wet seasons. The elevated structure allows water to flow naturally beneath, preventing the catastrophic flooding that would shut down conventional railways for months at a time. The construction process itself was a marvel of coordination. Chinese engineers worked alongside Kenyan workers, transferring knowledge and expertise in real time. Modern equipment operated alongside traditional methods. The railway rose from the landscape like something from the future, defying gravity and reshaping what was possible in African infrastructure development. But these bridges and elevated sections were just the skeleton. The true symbols of this transformation appeared where millions of people would gather daily. The station's gateways to modern Africa. You're stepping into architectural statements about Kenya's future. The Nairobi and Mombasa terminals aren't just train stations, they're monuments to modernization. Each facility stretches over 300,000 square feet, with soaring ceilings, modern security systems, sophisticated ticketing infrastructure, and passenger amenities that rival world-class stations in developed nations. The Nairobi Central Station sits in the heart of the capital, designed as a gateway that immediately announces Kenya's arrival in the modern era. Glass and steel architecture reflects contemporary design principles. The ticket halls accommodate thousands of passengers daily. The platforms are engineered for precision scheduling that allows trains to depart and arrive on exact schedules, something Kenya's transportation infrastructure had never achieved before. The Mombasa station serves as the critical link between the port and inland markets. This isn't just a passenger facility, it's a logistics hub. The station complex includes dedicated freight areas where containers can be transferred from ships to trains with mechanical efficiency. The entire operation is computerized, tracked in real time, and optimized for speed. But the emotional power of these stations extends beyond their physical specifications. For Kenyans, these weren't just new buildings, they represented arrival into a modern world. The stations announced that their nation could build infrastructure that competed globally. The architecture said something profound. Kenya was no longer just a developing nation. It was becoming a modern economic player. The stations also created employment. Construction jobs during the building phase numbered in the thousands. Permanent positions in station operations, maintenance, security, and administration provided stable employment for thousands more. The economic ripple effects extended throughout both cities. Yet the real transformative power of this railway lay in what moved through those stations and across those elevated tracks every single day. The freight revolution, moving millions of tons. You're witnessing the moment Kenya's logistics nightmare became a logistics marvel. Before the railway, Mombasa's port was essentially trapped. Container ships arrived constantly, but the cargo they unloaded faced a terrible choice: travel slowly by truck across challenging roads, or sit in storage while customers waited desperately for goods. The bottleneck was creating economic paralysis. Perishable goods spoiled during delays. Manufacturing deadlines were missed. Regional trade was constrained not by market demand but by physical transportation limitations. The port's capacity to handle incoming cargo was technically unlimited, but the capacity to move cargo inland was pathetically limited. Then the railway opened, and everything changed. The trains could carry 1,400 tons of freight per journey. Multiple trains operated daily. The railway could move cargo at speeds impossible for trucks averaging 40 miles per hour with no traffic, no weather delays, and no mechanical breakdowns from road conditions. What took 12 hours by truck took 4.5 hours by train. The economic implications exploded immediately. Cargo that spent days moving from port to market now arrived in hours. Port capacity expanded because cargo wasn't accumulating in storage. Regional markets that couldn't justify importing goods due to transportation costs now found those imports economically viable. Manufacturing operations across Kenya suddenly had access to raw materials from global suppliers that they couldn't previously afford to import. But the real tension emerged in the numbers. The railway moved millions of tons of cargo annually, tonnage that had previously been impossible to transport. This wasn't just incremental improvement. This was transformative acceleration of East African trade. Yet the economic explosion extended far beyond simple freight movement. It was reshaping which cities prospered, which markets expanded, and which nations held power in the region. The economic explosion reshaping regional trade. You're now watching how transportation infrastructure literally reshapes economics. Before the railway, Nairobi's location as Kenya's capital gave it political power, but physical geography limited its economic reach. Cities accessible by reliable transport became economic centers. Cities difficult to reach remained economically isolated. The railway changed that equation completely. Nairobi suddenly became the undisputed distribution hub for all of East Africa. Goods arriving at Mombasa could reach Nairobi in hours, then be redistributed to Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and beyond. Cities that were previously hours away by truck were now minutes away by rail connection. The effective economic geography of the entire region transformed. Port efficiency skyrocketed. Ships that previously spent days waiting to unload cargo because inland transportation was bottlenecked now unloaded quickly and departed. Port throughput increased dramatically. More ships meant more cargo, which meant more revenue for the Port Authority, more jobs in port operations, and more economic activity flowing through Kenya. The manufacturing sector exploded. Companies that couldn't previously justify operating in Kenya because transportation costs were prohibitive now found Kenya an attractive location. Why import finished goods at high cost when you could manufacture them locally and export them regionally at competitive prices? Manufacturing operations began clustering around the railway corridor. Regional trade patterns shifted. Countries that previously relied on slow road transport now integrated themselves into East African supply chains. Tanzanian goods reached Kenyan markets faster and cheaper. Ugandan products found new markets. The railway effectively created an economic integration zone across multiple nations. But this economic transformation came with strings attached. Kenya wasn't just becoming more prosperous, it was becoming dependent on a system financed by China and operated with Chinese expertise. That dependency would soon reveal its true strategic purpose. The geopolitical chess moved China's master strategy. You're now understanding a strategy that plays out across an entire continent. The Mombasa-Nairobi Railway wasn't an isolated investment. It was one piece of a massive puzzle. Zoom out from Kenya, and you see China financing similar infrastructure projects across Africa, railways in Tanzania, ports in Djibouti, highways in Ethiopia, power plants throughout the continent. Each project individually represents development. Connected together, they represent something far more strategic. a transportation and logistics network controlled by Beijing. Chinese engineers design the infrastructure. Chinese companies build it. Chinese expertise maintains it. The systems integrate with each other, creating interdependency. The real tension emerges when you understand the purpose. This isn't charity. This isn't development aid. This is systematic infrastructure control. When you control how goods move, you control which nations prosper and which nations struggle. When you control transportation networks, you control trade flows. When you control trade flows, you control economic power. The railway connects Kenya to other Chinese-financed infrastructure projects across the region. This network becomes increasingly valuable as more pieces are added. The economic logic favors integration with Chinese-designed systems rather than competing alternatives. African nations aren't consciously choosing Chinese dominance. They're simply following the path of least resistance, where existing Chinese infrastructure offers the most efficient routes. But this geopolitical positioning came with a price that Kenya would eventually have to reckon with: the debt-trap financial leverage disguised as development. You're watching a financial arrangement that looks like development investment but functions as strategic control. China financed the $5 billion railway through loans to Kenya's government. On the surface, the terms seemed reasonable. Modern infrastructure in exchange for debt repayment over decades. A simple transaction that would benefit both nations. Kenya gets world-class transportation infrastructure. China gets repaid with interest. Everyone prospers. But here's where the tension becomes undeniable. Kenya's government couldn't generate the revenue needed to service the debt. The railway was operationally profitable, moving millions of tons of cargo and thousands of passengers annually, generating significant revenue streams. But the interest payments and principal repayment that China demanded were astronomical. Year after year, Kenya faced an impossible choice: default on Chinese loans or find alternative sources of revenue. The government attempted to increase railway tariffs to generate more income, but raising prices risked losing freight customers to competitors or alternative routes. They couldn't squeeze enough additional revenue from passenger fares without making the service unaffordable to the Kenyan people it was supposed to serve. The mathematical reality was brutal. The railway's earning potential simply couldn't match the debt obligations China had imposed. Then came the moment that revealed the true purpose of the entire arrangement. As Kenya struggled to meet payment obligations, China didn't forgive the debt. They didn't restructure it to make it manageable. Instead, Chinese officials began discussing what would happen if Kenya defaulted. They discussed the option of taking control of the railway itself as collateral for unpaid loans. When you can't pay your debts, the lender can seize your assets. The railway that Kenya hoped would drive economic development could become Chinese-owned infrastructure operating on Kenyan soil. This wasn't theoretical, it was precedent. Sri Lanka couldn't repay Chinese loans for port development at Hambantota, so China took a 99-year lease on the port, essentially controlling a strategic asset that sits between major shipping lanes. Zambia's debt to China became so overwhelming that Beijing gained significant control over Zambian economic policy, forcing the government to make decisions that favored Chinese interests over Zambian welfare. Kenya was walking the exact same path. The real payoff of this strategy is subtle but absolutely devastating. Financial dependency becomes political leverage. When a nation owes billions to China, that nation's government must constantly consider Chinese interests when making decisions. Should Kenya make trade policy that angles away from China? Can they afford to, knowing that antagonizing their largest creditor could trigger demands for immediate repayment? Should Kenya align militarily with nations that China views as rivals? The financial chains make refusing very difficult. This wasn't the railway simply transforming Kenya's economy. It was the railway transforming Kenya's relationship with China into something resembling dependency. Every month that Kenya couldn't fully pay its obligations, the leverage China held over Kenyan sovereignty increased. The railway became less about transportation and more about control. Control that would reshape how Kenya governed itself, made foreign policy decisions, and positioned itself in global affairs. The $5 billion investment wasn't just buying infrastructure, it was buying political influence that would reverberate across the continent for decades. The Continental Network, connecting Africa to China. You're now seeing the complete vision that extends far beyond Kenya's borders. The Mombasa-Nairobi Railway is one strategic node in an extraordinarily ambitious continental transportation network. Zoom out from Kenya and look across the entire African continent, and an astonishing pattern emerges with crystal clarity. Railways financed by China connecting coast to interior. Ports controlled or influenced by China positioned at critical maritime choke points. Highways linking Chinese-designed logistics hubs. Industrial zones centered on Chinese manufacturing. And power plants generating electricity for operations that benefit Chinese interests. Ethiopia has a Chinese-financed railway connecting Addis Ababa to Djibouti's port. Tanzania has massive Chinese infrastructure investments reshaping its transportation networks. Djibouti's strategic port, sitting at one of the world's most critical shipping lanes where the Red Sea meets the Indian Ocean, was essentially built and financed by China, giving them control over one of Earth's most geopolitically significant locations. South Africa has Chinese involvement in critical ports and rail infrastructure. Nigeria, Zambia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola. Each nation across the continent has Chinese-financed or Chinese-built infrastructure projects that increasingly integrate with one another. The architectural genius of this strategy is that it doesn't require military occupation or political conquest in the traditional sense. It doesn't require stationing Chinese soldiers on African soil or imposing puppet governments that answer directly to Beijing. It simply requires building transportation networks so efficient and economically rational that integration with Chinese systems becomes the path of least resistance for African nations. Consider the economics from a Tanzanian manufacturer's perspective. Why would they ship goods across expensive, unreliable road networks to reach regional markets when they could use Chinese-financed railways that connect to ports financed by China, moving goods to markets efficiently and at lower cost? From a Zambian government perspective, why would they invest in competing infrastructure when Chinese-financed alternatives are already operational and functional? The incentive structure naturally gravitates African economies toward Chinese infrastructure because it's objectively more efficient. When goods can move efficiently through Chinese-designed railways to Chinese-controlled ports for shipping on Chinese-financed vessels, African nations aren't forced into dependency through coercion. They're incentivized into it through economic logic. By the time observers realize what's happened, the network is so deeply interconnected that African nations can't easily extricate themselves without economic catastrophe. Attempting to use alternative transportation routes would cost more, take longer, and disrupt supply chains. Breaking free from the Chinese network would require rebuilding competing infrastructure from scratch, something no African nation can afford. The Continental Network represents something unprecedented. A transportation and logistics system spanning an entire continent, financed by one nation, designed by one nation, operated with expertise from one nation, and benefiting one nation disproportionately. Its infrastructure-based dominance at continental scale. Africa isn't consciously choosing Chinese control. It's simply following the path of economic efficiency, which happens to lead directly to Beijing. The vision extends even further than economic integration alone. The influence equation. Reshaping African politics. You're witnessing the moment infrastructure becomes absolute political power. This is where the real transformation occurs, not in economics, but in how nations govern themselves and make decisions that affect their citizens' futures. When a nation depends on Chinese-built railways for economic survival, when Chinese companies maintain critical infrastructure that the nation can't replace, when Chinese loans dominate government debt portfolios, the political calculation changes at a fundamental level. Kenya's government must now constantly consider Chinese interests in foreign policy decisions. This isn't overt pressure or explicit demands. It's the quiet reality of dependency. Trade disputes with China become economically threatening because Kenya depends on Chinese infrastructure and Chinese markets for economic functioning. If Kenya makes trade policies that anger Beijing, China could theoretically restrict access to Kenyan exports moving through Chinese-controlled ports. Military alliances that China views unfavorably become risky because China could make infrastructure maintenance more difficult or expensive. Diplomatic positions that contradict Chinese interests become politically dangerous because refusing China means risking economic disruption. This is influence without occupation, political control without conquest, dominance, achieved through financial and infrastructure dependency rather than military force or direct political coercion.